to zip code, and today we will be looking into another cup of code. So we won't be going to code base today, but we'll be looking at some slides because I thought like it would be essential for you guys to get to understand these 5 things as we go into code and uh, going deeper into microservices and developing APIs. So it will be essential to know and understand what a DTO is, an entity value object, domain model, and a data access object. So the distinction between all of these will help us to sort of architecture our software or our system into in a better way, and also make you um, be able to create relationships with the insight of what's going on in your domain, and how different entities need to communicate amongst each other, and how they share data in between their communications. So with that being said, let's get to it. So we'll be defining all of these as I've mentioned. So the first thing that we're going to start on is, what is a data transfer object? So a DTO essentially is a POJO which only contains a storage and accessors. So here, of course, it will have your setters and getters, and it only does that, and it transfers the data between requests. So it could be a web API request and a response from the entity. So what this means is you can have a DTO that searches for an employee, or let's say you want to search users, a user DTO. If you're looking for users, you can pass in the username. The DTO object will have a username, and then you go retrieve the user details based on that DTO. So you take the DTO, push into an entity that will then go retrieve data from your storage mechanism or your persistence unit, then that will get the data from the database and bring that back. So what essentially these solves is that it decouples the domain model from the presentation layer. So the presentation layer is the client-facing request and response. So your DTO handles the request object and the response object, how that looks to the client-facing side, and then the domain model will be the entities that then get persisted into your database or your storage system. And it can have more or less fields than the entities. Like the example that I use now is of a user. So you know, a user, you'd have an ID, username, password, maybe any other unique field that you want to add in there, or another field that you want to add in there. But in the user DTO, you can just put a username to say, okay, now go retrieve this user, or add this user for me. You can have a user DTO that has username and the user roles that you want to assign that user. In the case of if you want to create a user, then it will go create that user with the roles that you specify in the DTO, and you have a mapper that will transfer your DTO value object into an entity value object. So what shares the data in between is what we call a mapper, and the mapper essentially translates the data or transfers the data from DTO into an entity object, which then gets to be persisted into your database. So the DTO is a flat data structure with no business logic, as it only handles the data transfer from request or response to the entity. So this could be you retrieving data from a request, or you persisting data into a database. So you push your DTO as a request DTO, and you also have a response DTO where you now say, okay, retrieve a user for me, and when you retrieve the user, I only want to see username and the roles, nothing else. I don't want to see password, I don't want to see any other thing, and the DTO will take care of that presentation for the response. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, what a DTO is. And let's move on to the next one. So what is an entity? An entity is a very important part of all of these because it's the one that interacts with your actual database. But look at how small it is. So an entity is a POJO mapped to a database table, meaning an entity instance is a record in the database table. So what does this mean? So if you are creating a new entity, it means the moment that entity gets persisted into a storage system or a database, that will be a record in the DB. So if you retrieve an entity from the database, that will retrieve a record in the database, and that's what an entity is. It's the direct communication with your storage system and how the data should look like. And JPA uses the entity to interact with the database, as I've mentioned. So that's how we can simplify an entity. So you can directly map it to a database table. That's what it is. And then on to the next one, we would say, what is a value object? So a value object is a simplified representation of an entity. So you can have a entity instance with simplified fields populated. So that will represent an entity in the DB, and you can use that value object to retrieve data or to update an entity based on that value object. So a value objects are and should be immutable, and the reason for that, you want them to remain in the state that they were when they were created, and they should not change. They should they should stay the same until they are disposed of. So this the reason why you want to have this in place is because you don't want to introduce some buggy changes on the fly whilst you are moving the data in between your transaction. So a value object, it forms an important part in building blocks of a domain-driven design, and that's why you need to use them to make sure that the data that you pass in between your entities is sort of clean, and nothing can break at runtime. So they help replacing primitives with more object-oriented classes related to a domain. So this sort of speaks to obviously object-oriented programming. So you're able to set the values there, then pass them through to your DAO, pass them through entity, pass them through and persist them to your database. And this sort of allows you to better architect the way that you handle transactions, and to safeguard your data in transit. So what is a domain model? So a domain model is a web of interconnected objects. Objects will be entities that communicate or share relationship to address a business case in the domain. So the business case is the actual domain. What do you want to achieve, and which entities do you need to achieve that specific business case? So this is achieved by rules and the business logic. So the entities will obviously communicate via the rules that have been defined and the business logic that you want to follow, a user and the roles, and which features they can access, and all of those. So the domain will define the relationships between those entities, and that relationship between all of these entities is what we call a domain model. So the domain model is defined by the business requirement and the business case between all the entities involved in delivering or solving that business case. So you will see, if you go deeper into this, you will see that a domain model, you have a domain model diagram. It shows you how the entities interact together to form the domain, and that will solve your business case. So a domain model is a visual representation of a real situation of objects in a domain. So this is more realistic and more practical way of taking the technical part and translating it into a business case that sort of makes sense of how the relationship should be and how you should design your API or your services, or how you should go about designing your domain essentially. And going further into the next one, so I think this will be the last one. And what is a data access object? So a data access object, there is actually a data access object pattern, which is a structural pattern that allows us to isolate the application from the business layer where all the business logic happens. So this it separates that from the persistence layer, which is the one that takes care of the database transactions and the CRUD operations in the database or the storage system. So at this point, you also able to abstract and encapsulate all access to the data source. So this will be database. So you want to abstract that responsibility from the business layer into a different layer that allows you to transact in the most meaningful way without compromising the two, especially the persistence layer. You don't want to compromise the database with just directly making calls to it or directly persisting data to it. So the persistence layer is there for that particular purpose. And via the data access object, we're able to sort of decouple these two responsibilities, and the one layer doesn't really know about the other, but they're able to communicate whenever we want to persist data to the database. So it manages the connection with the data source to obtain and store data. So the DAO, actually the DAO, manages the connection with the data source to obtain and store data. So that's the only job. It 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 runs all the CRUD operations on the data source or the database, and that's its only function. Whatever happens in the business layer stays in the business layer. Its only function, just take data, persist it, or take data, retrieve it, and that's it. That's what it's there for. And I think that's it for this course. I wanted to make it quick and I wanted to make it short so that on the next one we jump on the code. So for this one, guys, I'd like to say thank you. Remember to like and subscribe. See you on the next one. We will put all of this into code. Cheers.